Greetings, brothers. Today I'm talking about how you can utilize reserves and strategic reserves to get the win in victory in 10th edition of Warhammer 40,000. We're going to dive right in. Thanks for being here. Let's check it out. So thanks for being here, and if we are just meeting, then I am John, the Blood Angels Commander, and every week on the channel we try and make you a better player of Warhammer 40,000. This is what we're covering today: strategic reserves, basic reserves, charge chances and rapid ingress, because that is pretty important. How you can go about scoring, and I've got some examples from some of the games that I've played recently on the channel and how we've used reserves to score or be scored against, and then other reasons you might want to put some stuff into reserve. So if you're playing at the moment with nothing in reserve, that's fine, you can play that way. I've been using reserves now for probably a couple of years, and I think working out just what you need to put in reserve, or at least having some sort of game plan before you go to the table for your army, is pretty core. So let's talk about strategic reserves, and this is a lift straight out of the rulebook. Basically, in a 2,000 point game, which we normally play, you can put 500 points of your army into reserves. Strategic reserve units that are not deployed at the start of the battle, the combined points cannot exceed 25%, so that will be 500 points. Obviously, you cannot put fortifications into reserves. So for Marines, you're looking at maybe like a tank or a squad, probably like, you know, 2 squads, 2 tanks, maybe there's room for something else. Some people like to take like Voidsmen at Arms or the extraction squads, and I think they're pretty good, they're pretty useful as well, and we'll talk about them in a minute. So when you arrive from strategic reserves, how do you arrive on the battlefield? Obviously, you arrive in the reinforcement step of your movement phase, basically the end of your movement phase. Once you've arrived, you cannot then move on, and if those units have not arrived on the battlefield by the end of the game, they count as destroyed. So don't forget to bring your reserves on. I've been in tournaments before where I have forgotten to bring my reserves on. My opponent has forgotten to bring their reserves on, maybe in turn 3. You know, maybe if, just as they move into the shooting phase, if they've forgotten, you could be kind and remind them. Possibly, I was trying to think, I don't know if I ever did that when I won Best Sportsmanship at the last event I was at, but yeah, it's really kicks your ass if you forget your reserves. And I think probably if you're using them for the first time, you probably need to play a few times. You get used to playing with strategic reserves. Don't take them for the very first time at a tournament, or you might forget them. It's also like, if you've played 5 games at a tournament and you're tired, it can actually be easy to forget them by like game 5, just because you're tired and you're exhausted from playing 5 games. So during the second battle round, when your strategic reserves are arriving, you set up wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge, but you cannot set up in your opponent's deployment zone. Then from the third round onwards, you set up wholly within 6 inches of any battlefield edge. Obviously, you cannot be deployed within 9 inches of any enemy models. That is similar to basically any sort of reserves. So any reserves obviously have to come in 9 inches away, but the big change here from 9th edition is on the third battle round, you can now come in on the enemy's battlefield edge. So it can be very easy to assault the enemy's home field objective if you're coming in on their battlefield edge from a strategic reserve unit. Before, you could do that, you know, like if you had a unit that had like death from above or teleport strike, that they could arrive anywhere, that would be fine. They could obviously assault the backfield objective. But now, strategic reserve units have a decent sight, or have a decent chance to basically assault that backfield as well. And I've got a couple of examples of that as we go forward. So a reserve unit is a unit that starts the battle in a location other than the battlefield, so typically off the board. They always count as moving, a normal move in the turn they're set up on the battlefield. There used to be a caveat that there was no other way that they could get to move after they've arrived. That seems to be disappeared in 10th edition. So you've got some units, I don't play them myself, but I think you can, some units like Reavers maybe, that can shoot their pistols after they've arrived and then make a move. I think that's valid now to give themselves a shorter charge, but we don't really see Reavers on the board. Maybe I'll include them in a future video. Anyway, any specified distance from enemy models has to be adhered to, which would be 9 inches unless otherwise stated, like on the unit card. And obviously, you need to deploy them before the end of the battlefield. There was a big question mark because people thought in Leviathan that if you had units in reserve, you could bring them in turn 4 or 5. But I took a couple of photos from the little battlefield the little Leviathan pamphlet, and this was actually kind of difficult to find because it's in the Declare Battle Formation section, which is not the section I would have thought it was. But basically, in section 8, in that little Leviathan pamphlet, says, once you've basically choose which leaders or bodyguard units and who's inside transports, then you say which of your units will be in reserves, including your strategic reserves. No more than half the number of units from the player's army can start the battle in reserves. So that's a second restriction. So you've got your points restriction of 500 points on your strategic reserves, then you have an overall restriction on all reserves that no more of half. So if you have 10 units, only 5 of them can be in reserve. The combined points total of these units cannot be more than half of the army, so that's another restriction. So you don't have to have 5 units, and that would have to be basically no more than half, so 1,000 points in a 2,000 point game. Units embarked with transports that are set up in reserves also count as being set up in reserves for these limits. So if you have a unit inside a transport, you have to include them as like 2 units and also their points. When both players have done so, they declare their selections to their opponents. So you sort of decide that in secret and then tell your opponents what you're doing. And then this is the bit that's important. So this is in the Leviathan pamphlet, and I imagine this will be in the next chapter approved book. Reserve units cannot arrive during the first battlefield round, again unless otherwise stated. Any strategic reserves or reserves that have not arrived in the battlefield at the end of the battle round 3 count as being destroyed, as do any units embarked with them. So basically, if you don't bring them in turn 3, they're dead. And this doesn't apply to any units that move back into strategic reserves. Like if you had a unit that can come off the board and go into strategic reserve, that's fine. But the ones that you start off the board, they need to be in and basically be active by turn 3. I've got a little caveat, a little trick you can use on that later in these slides as well, so stick around for that. Okay, so in my current list, I'm just going to tell you what I'm playing in reserves at the moment. I've got my Chaplain and my 5 Death Company with Infernal Pistols and Power Fists. My strategic reserves are my 1 Death Company Dreadnought. I'm actually kind of playing around with the idea of maybe running 2 Death Company Dreadnoughts, but it's 1 at the moment. And then I've been using an Exaction Squad, which are 35 points. They're a little bit more durable than Voidsmen at Arms, but Voidsmen at Arms are good as well. These are basically what we like to call action monkeys, really cheap squads, 35 or 40 points. They can be put in reserves, and they can just come onto the board and do an action. They can come onto the board in a battle quadrant or potentially the enemy's deployment zone now in turn 3 and score behind enemy lines or something like that. Like there's lots of ways that you can use these guys, or if the enemy somehow manages to kill your home field objective, maybe you need to get it back. That's something else that this squad can be used for. So I'm trying to think back, like in 9th edition, I probably ran 2 or 3 units of strategic reserves in every game. I probably had a unit of Sanguinary Guard in reserve. I definitely had a unit of like Servitors or something like Action Monkeys cheap in reserves. And then sometimes I would also put a squad of Assault Intercessors in reserve. And one of the reasons I always used to put Assault Intercessors in reserve is because they're OC2, they're kind of cheap. And when they fight on an enemy objective, you get to reroll all wound rolls. I think you reroll all your wound rolls. I think it's reroll wound rolls of 1 if you're not on an objective. But what I would always do is I just bring in my Assault Intercessors because they're cheap unit, like 90 points. I think they were 95 last edition. They could be 85 now, but they're a cheap unit. And I just would always just go for a charge at their home field objective. I know it's maybe a high-risk charge. I know that it doesn't come off very often, but if it does, I suddenly have like 10 OC on your objective. And I'm probably going to kill a few things because I've got the reroll wounds on those chainswords. Power Fist may be on the Sergeant as well. Or even a Thunderhammer, right? So, lots of options. Lots of ways to use strategic reserves to your benefit. And this is what I wanted to talk about. So let's talk about like some of the new missions, right? We've got like Dawn of War and Sweeping Engagement here. There is other new missions as well. But if now I can come in on this battlefield edge in turn 3, you know, if the enemy has stickied this objective, if this is 16 and I can come in wholly within 6, I'm basically going to be on top of that objective or very, very close to it. I'm pretty sure I'll be able to control it. If they stickied that objective and moved off, I could bring in a squad of guys from strategic reserve against their battlefield edge and I could control that. And again, the same here, bringing in guys on the strategic battlefield edge. And also, it's very easy to threaten the backfield now. And if you're doing tactical objectives, there's a few things, there's a few ways. Like, I'll run through some of the objectives a little bit further in this video, but there's definitely a few that we can cover that will score you good points for like taking your enemy's home field objective, being behind enemy lines, setting up a teleport homer in their deployment zone. If you've got a 35-point exaction squad that can sneak into this corner, set up some teleport homers or something, I think it's very good. It used to be that they maybe, against strategic reserves, they would only need to screen from like here to here and here to here, but now it's very difficult to screen that whole backfield line as well. Okay, so let's talk about charge distances, because charge distance is important if you're going to try and come in and threaten that backfield objective. And I just wanted to show you that basically if you bring in the Death Company, who actually get a free with jump packs, who get a free reroll to charge, they get a 9-inch charge and a 47.8%. The only way we can get pluses to charge now are like the Chapter Champion, who I was going to say, who from the Command Squad that's basically going Legends, and the Primaris Chapter Champion, which you can't buy, he was only on Made for Order, and Dante. So I've put a picture of Dante here. If Dante is with a squad, he can make a charge with a reroll on 65% chance. However, I just want to talk about the 8-inch charge for a second here, because I'm a Blood Angels player. I have been a Blood Angels player. Obviously been doing those Blood Angels videos now for about 5 years, and I can tell you that having gone to many a tournament and brought in many a unit that had +1 to charge, I never feel like this is a 2 out of 3 chance. Like when I actually get to the board and I'm rolling this feels much more like a 50-50. Like this does not feel reliable in any shape or form. And you know, I've been in games where every single 8-inch charge, I've made them. I've been in games where every single 8-inch charge, I've failed them. And so sometimes when we talk about these charges from Deep Strike, I just always kind of think of them as a Hail Mary. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's in American football. And it's when it's at the end of the game and the only way you can win is getting a touchdown. So your quarterback throws the ball 50, 60 yards through the air into the end zone, and your whole team or enough of your receivers run into the end zone. They've got all their defense in the end zone, so it's a complete 50-50. And maybe you can catch it and score the touchdown, or maybe the defenders catch it and you don't get the touchdown. Like this is even an 8-inch charge to me honestly feels like a Hail Mary. And what a lot of people did last edition was they ran the Chaplain with the Aura to get +2 to charge, so they could get to this percent, 82 with the reroll. And this does actually feel really good. This feels really reliable. And from my testing, this happens. This charge goes off a lot of the time, right? You know, like, how often do you roll more than 7 on 2 dice with a reroll? Like, often when I would fail these 8 and 9-inch charges, I'd be failing them by, like, I'd be getting a 7, or in this one I might be getting a 6, you know? So it's like you're usually failing these by, like, 1 or 2. So this guy down here is a reliable one. So the only way to get the 7-inch charge in 10th edition is to take a Death Company Dreadnought, who I actually think is kind of too expensive. He's 195 points, which I do think is too expensive, or maybe 20 points over costed. But against monsters and vehicles, he'll get full hits to wound, and he'll get full rerolls to hit. He'll also potentially be able to fight twice if they fight him back. So I think he's probably your best bet. 195 points, 82-inch charge. Just keep anything above this, to me, feels horrible. I generally not going to try and do that. So in this case, this is where I'm going to start thinking about Rapid Ingress. We're going to cover Rapid Ingress, I think, after this slide. So let's talk about those new tactical objectives that I talked about, bringing units in from Strategic Reserve, right? Like, I just talked about putting an exaction squad in the corner of the battlefield to gain you some points. And, you know, that would be potential for engaging all fronts. And that would also synergize crazily with Investigate Signals, which is the one where, like, at the end of your turn, each corner of the battlefield that is one of more units, wholly within 9 inches, can be scanned by your army. If one or more corners are scanned, the secondary is achieved, and you score 2 VP for each corner scored by your army. So if you had 2 super cheap units, let's say you had 2 exaction squads, and you held your side of the board, in your opponent's, and you can sneak both of them into the 2 quarters of your opponent's. If you had these secondaries, Investigate Signals is scoring you 4, and Engage on all fronts is basically going to score you 4 as well. Assuming that you have some quadrants on your side as well, right? But my point is that, like, these reserve units, cheap reserve units on small bases, which are like the exaction squads, and also just general reserves that can come in and do actions, such as, like I mentioned, teleport Homer in your opponent's deployment zone for basically 4 VP if you're using fixed missions, or 5 if it's tactical missions, behind enemy lines again. Capture enemy outposts, that's take your opponent's home field objective, or the one in their deployment zone, for 8 VP. Right? Like, if you picked up 2 of these cards and you had what I have in reserve, the Death Company Dreadnought or the Death Company and the Chaplain, being able to jump and contest these objectives, it's kind of a lot of points up on the table. A lot for grabs. And I think my experience in 10th edition has... I'm going to show you an example of me winning a game using some of these in just a moment. Let's talk about Rapid Ingress first, though, because Rapid Ingress is, I think, really important now for Toughness 4 Marines when they arrive for Deep Strike. Because Toughness 4, and hell, even Toughness 5 Terminators die so friggin' fast in this edition. They're expensive, they die fast. If you're going to bring them onto the battlefield, you need to use every trick you can to basically help protect them. And Rapid Ingress, and obviously I just said that their chance of charging is terrible. So what you want to be doing is probably Rapid Ingressing them in your opponent's turn, hiding them inside some sort of obscuring cover if possible, or at least getting them into cover and getting them into a situation where they don't have to make those long, unreliable charges. A neat trick here, if you didn't know this, is you don't actually need to arrive in your turn 3 if you went first. Because if you went first, normally you'd have to bring in your reserves in turn 3, and then your opponent would do their turn 3. If you play Rapid Ingress, you can bring them in during your opponent's turn 3, which sort of gives you an extra little while to wait, maybe 1 unit in reserve. And this isn't limited to just strategic reserves, or this is any reserve unit can use Rapid Ingress. So just keep that in mind. 1 CP, I think it's really useful, and I think it's possibly even more useful on like Toughness 4 Marines, because they die so friggin' fast at the moment. I wanted to give you an example of some Rapid Ingress that I did here in this game that I played on the channel a couple of weeks back against the Demons. And the Demons came down very hard in like turn 2. There was a Bloodthirster, there was Bellicor, and there was the Great Unclean One. But what happened, the little Nurgle logo here on the home field objective meant he had stickied his home field objective and he had moved off. So I basically just, in his turn, this is important to know, it was in his turn, I Rapid Ingressed my Death Company and Chaplain onto his home field objective, because there was nothing within 9 inches of it, so I just nicked it. What that meant was at the start of the turn, I scored primary points on that because I hold it. He had nothing that he could get back to shoot me. He would have had to make like a 9-inch charge, and he was wanting to charge into the middle to kill this one soul blade guard, basically so he could control the middle. I actually also brought my Death Company Dreadnought back in the enemy deployment zone as well. I think this must be another, this must be the second turn, because I moved him forward, because I actually had some secondaries that meant that like I would score points. I think I had deployed Teleport Homer, and I think I also raised his home field objective. So in this game, my 2 main reserve units, my Death Company with the Chaplain and my Death Company Dreadnought, basically didn't do any fighting. But they did score me 25 points. Now, I only won this game by like 15 points. So basically what you're telling me is like, although these reserve units were designed to kill, in this game, they scored, and they scored big because I held this one for 2 turns, that was 10 points, and then I raised it, which means the Death Company performed the action to remove that objective from the battlefield and give me 10 points. And then this guy performed Teleport Homer. I actually think I had behind enemy lines as well, so maybe I actually scored more than 25 points with this Death Company. It might have been like 28, 29, and I think the Death Company Dreadnought obviously scored 4 for behind enemy lines or something. He was ready to fight. He really was ready to fight, but at this point the game was kind of swinging in my favour, in that I kind of held the middle, and I held this one, and I held this one. But my point stands that like these units were fighting units, but because they were in reserve, they were able to come in and perform what I needed them to do in a precise situation to grind out the win. Alright, next I wanted to talk for something that's a little bit harder for Marines to do, but this was a game that I played against Sisters of Battle, and I really actually, again, I just won this game slightly. If you've seen the last 2 pictures, you'll see that I'm running a lot of armor in my Blood Angels at the moment. Tanks. But regardless, in this game against Sisters, he had both investigate sites and engage in all fronts. So you can see here, I've clearly marked them, that he was able to put those two little Crusader units, excuse me, three little Crusader units. There's two guys, each one is 10 points, so it's just 20 points. So 1, 2, 3 corners of the battlefield has Crusaders. He also put a squad of Zerfim in this other corner. And basically, like, that scored him like 8 points on that investigate signals in one turn, 8 points on secondary, and then he also scored engage on all fronts, I think, for 4 points as well. This was a big swing, actually, and this was another very close game. But it just shows that, like, having these little squads, and also, if we really want to break this down, then this was the corners deployment. So by putting this guy's up here, he also had units in my backfield potentially ready to can try and contest my backfield for 8 points, and also behind enemy lines. So there's just so much that these guys can do. And yeah, this was a really tough game, but and this is obviously a little bit tougher for Marines to do, obviously, because we don't have access to 2 Crusaders for 20 points. I kind of thought, like, we talked a lot about this last edition when those 2 Crusaders cost 16 points, and we found that they were kind of broken and overpowered, but I guess they're back. Because they removed their limit for engaging all fronts to have like 3 people, and they removed the action limits and stuff like that. So the Crusaders, I was a Sisters player, I'd 100% be running 3 squads of these for 60 points. But you can do it with like exaction squads, and you can do it with Voidsmen at Arms. I think it's worth thinking about. Scoring is obviously a big thing. The game is very different now. Tactical missions as they stand score really, really well. I don't see many people running fixed. So being able to have the versatility to score those tactical missions, yeah, I think is really important. Okay. So what other reasons would you have to put strategic units into strategic reserve or reserve? And it's the Alpha Strike, right? That's one of the main reasons you would do it. You're typically bringing in hard-hitting units onto the battlefield with little or no risk of reprisal, because you arrive and you shoot before you get shot at. So in that exact game against the Sisters, he put 3 Castigators into reserve. They're about 140 points each, so that was like 420 points. I think that plus his 3 squads of Crusaders were basically his strategic reserves. And when these guys come on, these Castigators, this is what I talk about, like, obviously he didn't want me to kill the Castigators with, like, my Demolisher Cannons or my Heavy Laser Destroyers or whatever, so he just brought them in, and he went after my infantry, and each Castigator gets 8 autocannon shots with an 88% hit rate, 83% wound rate against toughness 4 Marines, so basically on average I've got almost 6 saves to make. Then he gets 9 heavy bolter shots, again I've got like 4 saves to make. They do have some other weapons on here, maybe a Stormbolt or a Hunter Killer Missile, whatever. But basically every failed save is dead Marine, or dead 2-wound Marine. And some of the failed saves against the autocannons would obviously be a dead 3-wound Marine. They are only -1, but I mean, it's still a lot of shots. Basically taking 10 saves from each Castigator on average. So he just brought in all 3 Castigators, and he killed every single infantry I had out on the board in one turn. I think maybe there was like 1 Blade Guard he couldn't see, so that 1 guy lived. But every single infantry I had out on the board, because I've been running a lot of transports, because I understand that 10th edition armor is very effectively costed, and probably infantry is not. So I just wanted to say that, like, if you have a plan around a unit that you can bring in from strategic reserve that you think can do a lot of damage and not be reprised against, then that is totally valid. And if you can also maybe then, you know, have some other units in reserve that can score points. Sisters are in a great position actually with these Castigators and the Crusaders to do that. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there, that like alpha striking units, you know, Gladiator Lancers probably don't need to be reserved because they have that like giant 72-inch range. But if you were playing against Knights and you thought, oh, there's a good chance you can kill my Lancers before I get to shoot, well, 3 Lancers, they're 145 points each. You could put 3 Lancers and an Exaction Squad or Voidsmen into reserve. If you bring all 3 Lancers and shoot them all at night, you're going to do some damage, I'm sure. And it just means that those Lancers are safe in turn 1 if you don't get to go first. So that would be the reason to put units into reserve. And yeah, overall, my sort of conclusion on strategic reserve is, since they have added those to the game in 9th edition, it's opened up a number of combos and options. And my plan for reserves really is to try and kill things. And I think a lot of people try and kill things. You know, and I'm going to be doing that using charges with my Death Company Dreadnought with those 7-inch charges, or potentially my Rapid Ingress Death Company But as I explained in the game I had just a few weeks ago, that Death Company and the Dreadnought never even fought in melee once. They didn't even try, really. They just came in and scored, what did we say, like at least 25, maybe 30 points. The game's up on the channel. If you look back, it was the game against Chaos Demons. You can see it. You can watch that game live. And the Death Company did nothing. They never even made a charge. They just basically sat and they did actions, which is not like Death Company at all. And we actually got to a point in the rules where we wanted the Death Company Dreadnought to do an action, and I was like scratching my head and I was like, can he do actions? Because he certainly couldn't do actions before, but it seems like now Death Company Dreadnoughts can do actions as well, which is, he was within range of the Chaplain, but I actually don't think that even matters anymore. There's nothing on his card that says he can't do actions. So my advice on strategic reserves, and reserves I guess, is to pick something that is flexible. Fast moving is probably pretty useful. Small units that can squeeze into tight spaces are pretty useful. And also putting something in strategic or regular reserves in most games and getting into a habit of using them, especially with these new tactical objectives, could actually be very useful. I hope this video has helped you think about your reserve play. But leave me a comment, and thanks for watching. I used to, I want to stress this, I used to reply to every comment on this channel. Since I've hit 13,000 subscribers, that has now become impossible. I would honestly have to spend like over an hour or 2 hours a day sometimes to answer every comment, and I was doing it even if it took like an hour every day. Now it's just got to a point where there's too many people watching and there's too many comments for me to reply to all of them. I do try and read most of them still, but if you don't get a reply, just, you know, if it's something you really want an answer on, ask me again in another video or ask me a similar question. I will get to. It's the best I can do. I have a family. I try and make these videos. It's a lot of time. So yeah, but thanks to everyone that subscribed. 13,000 subscribers is crazy. I didn't think we could get the channel this big, but let's get it bigger. Subscribe now and hit the like button on this video if you haven't. Thank you so much for getting to the end of the video. I do really appreciate you guys. If you want to support me, there's a huge big join button underneath this YouTube video you can click, or you can click down in the video description on Patreon. There's various links there as well if you want to, you know, buy some Warhammer and use one of my affiliate links. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great week. I am now officially back from holiday, so I think live games will start back up next week on Wednesday night. Army list show breaking down some of the community's best submitted army lists will start as well. And if you've got any video suggestions you would like to see, then there's a video suggestions channel over in Discord where you can just drop any suggestion and maybe I'll pick it up and do it in a future video. Thank you again for watching to the end. I will catch you in the next one, brothers. By the blood are we made strong. Peace.